What if the real reason you're feeling incredibly anxious today isn't because you forgot to meditate this morning
Ah,
or because you drank way too much coffee,
mm.
but actually because you just happen to be married or, I mean, because you have a family.
Yeah, that is a pretty massive leap.
Right. But today we're doing a deep dive into a really radical manifesto that claims exactly that. It basically argues that the only way to genuinely cure your anxiety is to get this, it completely abolish the family unit, erase every single national border, and just completely dismantle human society as we know it.
It is definitely quite the escalation from your typical, daily self-help advice.
Yeah, just a bit.
We are looking at a really fascinating essay from January 2022. It's titled "How to Break Free from Suffering," and it's by an author named Feng. And I think before we get too deep into the weeds here, it's really worth noting for you listening that we are sort of walking through a highly provocative museum exhibit today.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, we aren't here to endorse the artist or, validate these deeply unconventional political and social viewpoints. Our goal is strictly to examine the architecture of this philosophy. We want to understand how it diagnoses human pain and, honestly, how it justifies some truly extreme solutions.
Right. Think of us as completely impartial curators, because when you read this essay, you immediately notice that the author, he doesn't just want to treat the symptoms of human suffering. He kind of wants to, burn down the entire hospital and build something entirely unrecognizable in its place.
Exactly. Burn it to the ground.
But to understand the blueprint for this totally new world he's proposing, we really have to start where he starts, which is with his definition of suffering itself. And he casts a really massive net here, right?
Oh, absolutely. He's talking about feeling uncomfortable, depressed, troubled, anxious, fearful, hopeless. I mean, he is looking at the entire spectrum of human misery.
Every bad feeling you can have, basically.
Right. But rather than treating all of that as just one giant, tangled mess of negative emotion, Shufeng categorizes suffering into three very distinct pillars. So we have physical, spiritual, and mental. And the distinctions he makes between these three, they're really critical to understand his entire worldview.
Okay, let's unpack this. So physical suffering seems pretty self-explanatory, I think. It's biological, right? Like you break a leg or you get an infection.
Yes, exactly. And the key mechanism for physical suffering in this text is that it can be endured, and more importantly, it can be healed through completely tangible means.
Like medicine or rest.
Right, time. It has a physical limit. You put a cast on a broken bone, eventually it heals. But then there's spiritual suffering, which he treats entirely differently.
Yeah, how does he define spiritual suffering compared to the physical? Because, I mean, those two often get really blurred in our modern wellness culture. People talk about them like they're the same thing.
They do, yeah. But in this specific framework, spiritual suffering is essentially an existential void. It's like losing your compass. It's a lack of ultimate meaning or connection to the universe. And the author argues that this specific type of pain is eliminated entirely by establishing faith in what he calls the greatest creator.
The greatest creator. Okay, that sounds like a universal overarching cosmic source rather than a specific deity from like an organized religion.
Yeah, that is a very accurate way to look at it. It's his term for this ultimate unifying cosmic intelligence. And by establishing a direct connection to that source, the spiritual void is filled. Your compass is restored. So physical suffering has medicine. Spiritual suffering has faith. Both have these prescribed functional antidotes.
Which brings us to the third pillar, which is mental suffering. And reading through the essay, this is where the text really digs its heels in. I mean, he identifies mental suffering as the absolute core problem of human existence.
He does. And he totally strips away all the complex psychological jargon we're so used to hearing today. He argues that the absolute singular root of all mental suffering just boils down to a lack of freedom. It is the friction of restriction.
Right. It's like having this corrupted operating system running in the background of your computer, constantly draining the battery and overheating the processor. You might not actually see the code, but it limits every single application you try to open. And he breaks this operating system of restriction into four specific areas, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. He categorizes the restrictions as physical, mental, financial, and freedom of action. So if your physical body cannot go where it wants, you suffer. If your mind is forced into a certain dogma, you suffer. If you lack the financial resources to live as you wish, or if your daily actions are dictated by someone else,
You suffer mentally.
exactly, it's all restriction.
But here's where my mind goes with that, because we usually think of a lack of freedom as mostly circumstantial. Like, I lack financial freedom because inflation is high right now. Or I lack physical freedom because I have a super demanding 9 to 5 job just to pay my mortgage. It's systemic, sure, but it feels somewhat abstract.
Right, but the author completely rejects the idea that it's abstract. He provides this highly specific, almost mechanical diagnostic tool to figure out exactly who or what is locking you in that invisible cage. He calls it searching from near to far.
Searching from near to far. And the premise here is based entirely on physical and emotional proximity.
Yes. The text asserts this direct, inverse relationship between distance and acute mental suffering. His logic is basically that the closer someone or something is to you in your daily life, the more capable they are of creating that grinding, constant restriction of freedom.
So to find the root of your misery, he's saying you shouldn't look at macroeconomic trends or, I don't know, distant geopolitical conflicts. You really just need to look at whoever is sitting across from you at the breakfast table.
That is the core of the near diagnostic. The text explicitly lists the closest sources of suffering. He says it's your spouse, your parents, your children, your siblings, your colleagues, and even your closest teachers or fellow practitioners in whatever community you belong to.
Okay, hold on, though. That completely flips traditional family values upside down. We are historically taught that the family unit, your spouse, your home, that's your primary defense mechanism against a cruel world. It's supposed to be your sanctuary. Yet this author is arguing that your spouse and your parents are actually the primary engines of your mental pain.
He argues that precisely because they're close to you, they're the ones enforcing the boundaries of your daily life. Like a distant dictator doesn't tell you what time to be home for dinner.
Right.
They don't criticize how you raise your kids or how you spend your weekend. The people closest to you do that. And to really drive this home, he contrasts these near sources with what he calls far sources of suffering.
And the far sources are things like thieves, bullies, gangs, extremist groups, governments, political parties, nations, religions.
Correct. And his highly controversial conclusion is that the suffering caused by those distant entities is actually easier to bear than the suffering caused by your own family.
I mean, I really struggle with that logic. Are we saying a literal gang of thieves breaking into my house or an extremist group operating in my country is supposed to be easier to endure than, like, a disagreement with my sibling?
I know it sounds wild, but if you look at it through his lens of constant daily friction, the internal logic begins to take shape. Think about it. A thief restricts your financial freedom once by stealing your wallet. It's acute, yeah, but it's temporary.
Yeah.
A difficult marriage or an overbearing family, that restricts your physical freedom, your financial freedom, and your freedom of action every single hour of every single day for decades. And the text correlates these specific institutions directly to those 4 types of restriction we mentioned earlier.
Let's actually break those correlations down, because this is where the blueprint for his revolution really starts to form. How exactly does he map these massive societal institutions to our personal suffering?
Well, the author states that physical restriction, so that's the day-to-day limitation on your body and your time, stems primarily from marital relationships.
Because marriage is, by definition, a contract of exclusivity and shared geographic obligation. Like, you physically cannot just pack up and move to another continent on a whim if you are tethered to a spouse's career and a shared mortgage.
Exactly. You are physically anchored. Then he points to mental restriction, which he blames entirely on political parties and religions, because these institutions demand ideological loyalty. They tell you how to think, who to vote for, what is morally acceptable.
Which completely restricts the freedom of the mind.
Right.
What about financial restriction, then? Because earlier I mentioned inflation or the job market. Who does he blame for that?
He places the blame for financial restriction on relatives and market monopolies.
Relatives. So, like, the societal expectation that you have to financially support your aging parents or put your children through expensive schools, he views that not as a noble duty or love, but as a literal financial trap.
Yes, the obligation itself is the cage. And finally, he addresses restricted movement. So the inability to just travel freely across the globe, he says that's caused by the machinery of the state, things like borders, passports, visas.
So if we step back for a second and look at this diagnostic framework, the author is systematically pointing his finger at the foundational pillars of human civilization. I mean, marriage, family, religion, the economy, the nation-state. He is saying, look at these structures. These are the lines of code in the operating system that are draining your battery.
What's fascinating here is that because he diagnoses the structure itself as the disease, he naturally concludes that all of our traditional, socially approved methods of coping with stress are entirely useless.
Yeah, That makes sense. If the house is structurally collapsing, rearranging the furniture in the living room isn't going to save you from the roof caving in. Which brings us to how the text views modern self-help philosophy and therapy.
The author pulls absolutely no punches here. He claims that when you are facing systemic structural suffering, traditional moral education is just a waste of time. I mean, teaching someone to be a more patient, moral person inside a system that actively restricts their freedom, it doesn't cure their suffering. He says it just makes them a more compliant prisoner.
And he dismisses the teachings of ancient sages too, doesn't he?
He does. He argues their preaching has almost no lasting effect on this specific kind of structural misery.
I would imagine he's equally critical of religion as a coping mechanism, given that he already labeled it a primary source of mental restriction.
Oh, definitely. He describes religious doctrines as merely a temporary anesthetic. Like, it might numb the existential pain for a moment, it might give you a temporary sense of community, but once that anesthetic wears off, you are still trapped in the exact same restrictive life.
He also uses a phrase that feels incredibly pointed at the modern wellness industry. He dismisses a lot of modern spiritual practices as just chicken soup for the soul.
Yeah, he views all of those practices, mindfulness, self-help books, meditation retreats, as just scratching the surface.
So all those mindfulness apps you download when you're stressed and trying to deal with burnout, the author's essentially saying you're just trying to put a Band-Aid on a sinking ship. You're trying to optimize your suffering rather than eliminate it. You can't just, mindfulness your way out of a marriage that restricts your physical freedom or meditate away a national border that dictates where you can live.
That is the absolute crux of his argument. You're trying to find comfort inside the broken operating system, rather than writing a new one. Therefore, his ultimate fundamental solution is that we must entirely rebuild the order of human production and life. Not reform it, not pass new laws, completely rebuild it from the ground up.
Okay, so if the ship is sinking and the whole system needs to be rebuilt, what exactly is the new source code? Like, what is his blueprint for a new society that doesn't generate this mental suffering?
This is where the essay shifts from a philosophical diagnosis into a very concrete manifesto. The text lists 6 specific radical measures that he says are required to completely eliminate human suffering. These are massive structural demands.
Let's walk through the mechanics of these 6 steps, because here's where it gets really interesting. And honestly, they escalate incredibly quickly.
They do. So step 1, eliminate marriage and dissolve families.
Wow, just going straight for the jugular right out of the gate. So if marriage is the primary restrictor of physical freedom, you don't offer couples therapy, you just eradicate the institution of marriage entirely.
The logic is ruthless, but it is internally consistent with his rules. Step 2, ban political parties from government management. Step 3, ban religion from government affairs.
So, if parties and religions restrict mental freedom by forcing ideological conformity, they have to be completely removed from any position of systemic power.
Precisely. Which leads to step 4, open all borders among countries to allow for free global migration.
Erasing the machinery of the state to cure the restriction of movement, it's amazing how mathematically he approaches this. Like, every diagnosis has an equal and opposite structural demolition. But it's kind of like a surgeon deciding that because a bone in your arm is broken, the only permanent cure is to surgically remove your entire skeletal system. I mean, you can't just leave a body without a skeleton. What replaces all of these dismantled institutions?
And that brings us to steps 5 and 6, which introduce his alternative structure. Step 5 is promoting the production and life mode of something called the second home of Lifechanyuan. And step 6 is having all global citizens move toward this era of Lifechanyuan.
Okay, Lifechanyuan. We definitely need to define this because it really sounds like the absolute core of his utopian vision. What exactly is a Lifechanyuan?
The term roughly translates to a sort of life Zen garden, or a sanctuary for life. But in the context of the author's broader philosophy, this second home of Lifechanyuan isn't just a metaphor. It is a proposed physical, communal living arrangement. It's a highly structured, idealized community model that is meant to entirely replace the traditional family and the capitalist economic structure.
So instead of living in a nuclear family in, a suburban house with a white picket fence, you are living in a borderless communal sanctuary where resources are pooled and the frictions of all those traditional obligations are supposedly erased.
That is the theory, yes. And the text claims that the author has already prepared this path for humanity's happiness, moving this concept from pure theory into actual practice. The essay is essentially an invitation, or really a demand, to transition into this new era.
But operationally, I mean, how does a global society function without laws, borders, or traditional governments? If we completely dissolve the nation state, what keeps the trains running? Who decides how resources are allocated if there's no state?
The author is actually very deliberate in explaining what this future society will not be. He explicitly rejects the Western legalistic model, which he calls rule by law, and he uses the United States as his primary example of what not to do.
Really, why does he reject rule by law? I think most people would argue a strong constitution and a legal framework are pretty much the only things keeping society from just descending into total chaos.
Well, in his view, a hyper-legalistic framework assumes that humans are inherently flawed, selfish, and constantly need to be policed and punished. It's a system built entirely on distrust and restriction. But he also rejects what he calls rule by man, pointing to China as the example of that system.
Because rule by man relies on centralized authority and the whims of individual leaders, which inevitably leads to corruption and, again, the restriction of freedom.
Exactly. So he rejects both the legalistic model and the authoritarian model. Instead, he introduces a concept he calls the holographic way. In the original text, it is referred to as Hunden Daozi.
The holographic way. Okay, if we think about how a hologram actually works in real life, every single fragment of a holographic image contains the information of the entire picture. Like, you can cut a hologram in half, and both halves still show the whole image. Is he suggesting a society where every single individual perfectly reflects the harmony of the entire system?
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it, actually. In the holographic way, there is no need for external laws forcing you to behave, because you are internally aligned with the ultimate truth of the universe, that connection to the greatest creator we mentioned earlier. But it isn't entirely anarchic either. The text states that this system is guided by saints and managed by sages.
Guided by saints and managed by sage. I mean, it sounds incredibly poetic, but practically speaking, that raises a massive red flag. In a world with no elections, no constitutions, and no borders, who gets to decide who the saints and sages are that manage us?
Yeah, that is the unavoidable tension in the text. There is a staggering, almost overwhelming level of self-assurance in the author's writing. He frequently uses the pronoun I, stating I have prepared the path. He is not just functioning as a philosopher observing from a distance, he is really positioning himself as the primary architect of this entire new era.
The implication being that the recognition of these saints and sages flows directly from the ideological framework that he himself has created. So it's actually a massive top-down global reset, even if it claims to be entirely liberating.
It is a paradox common to a lot of utopian visions, right? To achieve absolute freedom, you must completely submit to a highly specific, singular vision of what freedom looks like.
Totally. So let's say everyone does it. Assuming everyone submits to this holographic way, what does the payoff actually look like? What is the day-to-day reality of this utopia he is promising?
The text paints a picture of absolute, unblemished perfection. It describes a world where all of humanity operates as one family. In this era, no one would ever pocket an item they found on the street. People would literally leave their doors unlocked at night without a second thought.
So total societal trust, a complete eradication of the need for personal defense or security.
And total societal support. The young are perfectly educated without the stress of modern schooling. The elderly are completely cared for without that financial burden falling on their children. Every single person's talents are fully utilized, meaning no one is trapped in a soul-crushing job just to survive. All global resources are managed with maximum efficiency.
It's the ultimate promise of harmony. But wait, earlier you mentioned something even more bizarre about the weather in this new era.
Oh, yes. The text goes way beyond just social harmony and ventures into actual cosmic harmony. It explicitly claims that this era will feature favorable weather conditions and thriving industries.
Wait, I need to pause there. How on earth does dismantling political parties and dissolving marriages change the meteorological weather patterns?
Well, in his framework, human society isn't separate from the natural world or the cosmos. It's all connected. If you align human production and life perfectly with the universe through the holographic way nature responds in kind, the belief is that the chaotic disharmony of human suffering and our restrictive institutions actually manifests physically as chaotic weather and natural disasters.
Wow.
So by curing the social disease, you literally cure the earth.
That is just, wow. So the ultimate promise of this essay is a wealthy, abundant, borderless world with perfect weather where the very concept of human suffering has been permanently eradicated.
It is a staggering conceptual leap. He He starts with a very real, very relatable diagnosis, the friction and anxiety of daily life, and he uses that to justify the complete dismantling of the modern world in favor of this cosmic utopia.
It really is an incredible trajectory to track. I mean, we started this deep dive talking about why you might feel completely overwhelmed and stressed out on a random Tuesday afternoon. We looked at how the people closest to you, your societal obligations, and the basic structures of your life create this invisible cage that drains your energy. And we just watched that premise transform into a radical manifesto demanding the dissolution of marriage, borders, and governments to achieve a utopian holographic way.
It is a fascinating intellectual exercise. And again, while these ideas about the second home of Lifechanyuan are deeply controversial, exploring them allows us to see how far some philosophies will stretch to diagnose and attempt to cure the human condition, even if those proposed cures require tearing down the very fabric of society.
It certainly completely reframes how we think about mental health, dragging it out of the therapist's office and placing it squarely on the global geopolitical stage. And it leaves you with a really profound question to chew on as you navigate your own obligations this week.
Absolutely.
The author argues that true mental peace is fundamentally impossible as long as societal structures like your family, your job, and your nation restrict your freedom. It makes you wonder. Can anyone truly achieve genuine inner peace while living within the boundaries and compromises of modern society? Or is the concept of finding your personal zen just a comforting illusion? Just a little story we tell ourselves to make sitting inside the cage a little more bearable?
That's the big question.
Thank you so much for joining us on this intellectual journey today. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep exploring, and we will see you on the next deep dive.